Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the uncompromising libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. And we have the honor and pleasure of a special guest today, co-host Bryan Caplan, who teaches economics at George Mason. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to be back with our viewers and listeners and to have Bryan as our guest.
Yeah, we wanted to have Bryan on. He's one of the stout libertarians in the movement, teaches at George Mason University. But really specifically, Bryan, we wanted to have you on to discuss your new book, which is creating quite a bit of controversy among the establishment, not surprisingly.
Oh, you mean this book?
That's it.
That one? Okay,
what
good.
A coincidence.
Yes.
The Case Against Education, Why the Educational System is a Waste of Time and Money by Bryan Caplan. And Bryan, you're getting all kinds of reviews in the mainstream press, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. You're upsetting a lot of people in the education establishment. Why don't you give us a little synopsis of what the book is about, why you wrote it, and what your intentions are with it?
Yeah, well, most of what the book says is that while education actually pays pretty well for the individual student, it's a very bad investment of taxpayer money. And the reason is that most of what happens in school is not actually acquiring skills, but jumping through hoops. So I said, there's two ways that education could raise your income. One is it actually teaches you how to do new stuff and produce more. And in that case, you go and make more money and you produce the very extra, you're producing the value that you're earning. But on the other hand, if the main thing that's going on is that you're jumping through a bunch of hoops to impress employers to get certification, that's basically a way for you to get more money without making the pie bigger, just by looking good, right? And then, so that's the key idea of it. So it's really different from almost any other book that you'll read complaining about the education system, because I'm not saying that it's generally a bad investment, selfishly speaking. I'm saying it's a bad investment, socially speaking, which, of course, for libertarians is really the key points. In terms of like how we got started on this, honestly, this idea has been in my head for as long as I can remember. Even in kindergarten, I was there saying, why do we have to learn so much stuff that we're never going to use after we finish school? And, the answer, well, you have to do this in order to get a good job. And say, well, okay, that seems true because everyone with a good job has done this stuff. But why? Why would employers care about whether you've studied Aristotle or taken a foreign language that you never use? And this book is really an effort to explain it to myself back in kindergarten. If only I could go back in time.
It's funny you mentioned kindergarten because my experience was much the same. As I was going through elementary school and junior high and high school. I was taking subjects. I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer, and I would take stuff like geometry and trigonometry and Texas history or whatever, and saying, what does this have to do with what I really want to be in life? And when I got to college, I was an economics major, and I wondered whether, as an economics major, once I got out in the real world, if I was an economist, whether I would be doing demand curves and supply curves and stuff. And so a lot of it's irrelevant. And when I later started delving into this, as a libertarian, we call for getting the state entirely out of education. Mm-hmm. I realized that the word educate itself is the root of that word is seeking. And it occurred to me as I was learning libertarianism, which was entirely self-taught, that it's a seeking process, that you get hungry for some kind of area of knowledge, and you want more and more, and you start reading voraciously, and you guide your own learning process by your passion for that particular subject. While in school, it seems the exact opposite. It's cram this information, cram this subject, cram that, which seems to me is totally contrary to the natural system of education.
Yeah, in general, I agree. There are some very useful skills that are boring for a lot of people, and for those, if you're, even if they don't want to seek it, the kid needs to learn how to read and do arithmetic. But for so much of what's in the curriculum, if the person isn't interested, then it's hard to see what the harm would be if they didn't learn it.
Yeah. Richard?
Yeah, let me sort of play devil's advocate here a little bit for viewers to hear your responses. It must be about 30 years ago, there appeared a book called Cultural Literacy by E.D. Hirsch. You may remember the book. Yeah. And he was bemoaning the fact that there, in fact, was the loss of a common intellectual sort of background that all people would learn and share. He would say, imagine that you're back, let's say, 70 years ago, and someone says a phrase, and everyone would understand the poignant meaning of it because it was a line from some piece in Shakespeare, for instance. And the argument that what unifies people, just as human beings, as well as members of a particular society, if there isn't a common cultural continuity, of which Hirsch was referring to one of them, and that surely that gives a value to the idea of, however one is defining it, the foundation of a broad liberal arts education as part of the educational process by which you learn the skill to earn a living. Could you give a reply or comments on that?
Yeah, sure. There's so much you could say. The first thing is that E.D. Hirsch was almost certainly right about the level of cultural literacy at the time that he was writing. He's wrong to think it was ever noticeably better. Right? All the data we have going back as far as we can see shows that the vast majority of people have always been culturally illiterate. So this is just harsh reality. There's never a time when most people would have recognized lines from Shakespeare or anything else like that. Most people are overwhelmingly Philistines. It's always been so. So if someone says our society can't survive without cultural literacy, it's like, well, you're wrong, because society exists and we've never had cultural literacy. So how can that really be so? In terms of the value of it, what I would say is that I think it'd be great if we could get higher levels of cultural literacy, but the education system we have has done a very poor job of instilling that. You could say, well, let's redouble our efforts. The important thing to remember is we already put in so many years without much results. So again, it's one thing if we put in 3 weeks into cultural literacy and then people didn't have it. Then you say, fine, let's increase it to 30 weeks or 3 years. If you already do 10 years and you have almost nothing to show for it, which we don't, then at this point, I think it is very reasonable to say, like this just isn't worth it, and we just have to accept that most people aren't going to be interested in this stuff, and take some consolation in the fact that the internet now makes it possible for anyone at any stage in their life to acquire cultural literacy if and when they feel like doing it.
Well, let me sort of extend sort of this is that the title of your book is The Case Against Education. But of course, classical liberals, libertarians, try to make the distinction between formal education that is supplied and financed and chosen through the private sector, the full privatization of schooling and education, versus that which is imposed upon people, first through mandatory grammar in high school, and then the pervasive network of often state-funded, directly, indirectly, partly, totally, institutions of higher learning, with the accreditation system that's imposed upon virtually every such college or university. Could you talk a little bit about the difference, private, state-funded, et cetera, et cetera?
Right. So as a libertarian, I want to believe that there's a huge difference between what goes on in public schools and what goes on in private schools. But I've experienced both, and I've looked at the data for both, and I just see very little difference between what they're generally like. So I didn't want to write a book saying that what goes on in private schools is great when it seems to be so almost equally packed full of irrelevant material, just like public school. So in what sense is it a libertarian book? I said, well, really, we're focusing on the wrong thing instead of focusing on exactly what's taught. It makes more sense just to focus on the subsidies. So there's about $1 trillion of government support for the industry happening. Again, this is like an annual spending. And so I say that what really libertarians should be focusing on is just reducing the level of subsidies. And so I'm happy to analogize education to football, right? So you could go and say the problem is that government support for football stadiums is distorting a once noble game. But then you might say, well, wait a second, they're playing basically the same game at the government-supported stadiums as at the totally private stadiums. And I say, well, the real distortion is just pouring a ton of money at an industry way beyond what market demand would actually sustain. So that's really the heart of my critique is instead of focusing on a different kind of education, focus on less.
Well, let me, Jacob, let me just follow up with one more thing on that. You used a word that perhaps you can amplify.
Uh-huh.
That today, young people are attending college, university, for instance, high school as well, and they're not getting relevant knowledge or information. Now, I think it would be useful if you define what you mean or do not mean in this context by the word relevant knowledge or information.
Yeah, so I mean, relevant, I simply mean knowledge that you're going to use, that you're going to use with some at least moderate frequency once you actually finish school. So again, primarily I'm thinking about knowledge that you would actually use in a job. Although, of course, if it were something that you might use for pleasure, that would be fine too. Again, since most people seem to get so little pleasure from ideas and culture, I do focus on employment mostly, but I do have a separate chapter on just education for its own sake. But, the way that I put it is this. So education needs to be either useful or enjoyable. One or the other is fine. So if it's useful but not enjoyable, like you don't really like reading, but you acquire a useful skill, that's fine. And on the other hand, if you're reading history because you enjoy history and you get some sense of satisfaction out of that, that's fine. But if education is neither, then I say that regardless of your political views, you really need to call that waste. To say what's the point of it if it doesn't accomplish either thing?
All right.
Right?
Well,
especially what is the point of taxpayers supporting it, which is I think the real kicker.
Well, following up on that, Brian, I mean, let's say that, I mean, the libertarian ideal obviously is a total separation of school and state. And at the elementary school level, high school level, we're talking about no more public schools, a total free market in education, no compulsory attendance laws, no school taxes, no school buildings, everything private. And that doesn't necessarily mean people go to private schools. It could be homeschooling, it could be self-education, any kind of free market ideal. And then at the college level, that would mean the termination of all government support of colleges. So everything would be privately funded with registration fees or donations and the like. It seems to me that if you have that libertarian ideal, that you're actually making a case, you're going a step beyond that, and you're saying that even if that were the case, you seem to be making a case against going to college generally. Or are you suggesting that it's the state involvement here that is somehow distorting or warping what's going on?
Right. Well, I'd say I'm not so much making a case against going in a totally free regime. I would say I'm making a case against philanthropy, just to get to get more people that are just looking to go and get a certification to go. So again, the key distinction I make is just between the selfish payoffs for education and the social payoffs. So selfishly, I never deny that education normally is a good deal, at least for people who who are successful students or find or do well in school. But socially, what I say first of all is that we have a lot of waste now, and so I am saying that in a way government is subsidizing something where the normal market tendency is actually to produce too much of it, just because there is this redistributive element. Or again, even a totally private system, someone might go to school just to impress employers, and if a lot of people do that, then the problem is that everyone can't be impressive, right? So if a lot of people do it, then this just ratchets up how much education you need. Now in the book I do have a section called What I Really Think, and that there I do in a Princeton University Press book just advocate separation of school and state, like you say. But again, I say that in order to get to that, I think you need to combine libertarian values with the facts, right? So I say, for me, libertarianism sets presumptions, and so if your presumption is the best thing, unless there's a really good reason otherwise, is for government to do nothing, then I think you come away with that very same conclusion. On the other hand, if you were, say, utilitarian or had some other view, then you might end up with a different position.
All right. Well, you make reference. You seem to favor what you call vocational education. And I was a lawyer. I practiced law for several years. And of course, to get a law degree, you have to go to a state-approved college and get a state-approved law degree from a state-approved school. That's the only way you get a license. Well, in the 19th century, you could become a lawyer by apprenticing with a lawyer. And it's sort of a self-education process. And
like
so,
Lysander Spooner.
yeah. Now,
Yeah.
is that what you mean by vocational, or are you relating vocational to some type of trade kind of work?
I mean, so that's one form, and again, probably the best form actually, since most people don't learn from lectures; they learn by doing. So you can be like in that part of the book, that's where I say, look, if we're going to be having any taxpayer involvement at all, at least taxpayers ought to get something good for their money. And I say that from the point of view of taxpayers, it's it's a lot better to if their tax dollars are spent to train people how to do useful things than just jumping through hoops. So and again, of course I'm very supportive. Indeed, like my ideal would be a world where where it was a totally private system. But you can still say, like, if you're going to have public schools funded by taxpayer money, better to go and train people to do real things. And, like some of the things I talk about, how about just giving people regular school credit for having a job in high school, right? So, it's a way of saving taxpayers money at the same time, also gives students useful skills.
Yeah, Richard?
Yeah. Now, as a libertarian, you obviously think people should make all of these choices, but sort of making the types of quality predictions economists try to do. Well, if the market was free, this is how it might look. Mm-hmm. If the educational system was along the lines that you're suggesting, how do you see the nature of the types of schools that would be available? Obviously, it would be a diversity of schools. Mm-hmm. And how do you think that would impact the number of people who actually pursued higher education? Mm-hmm. Would it be more or less or the same today within this different diversity or focus of what is being learned?
Yeah, so would more or fewer people pay for, would more or fewer people do higher education if there were no government support for it? Yeah, less, a lot less. I mean, the same thing with K through 12. I think people would be leaving school at much earlier ages, which again, I think is actually all for the good because most people don't enjoy especially the later years. And they're also generally not learning very useful stuff. So I think it would be much better if people were actually getting jobs and learning by doing. And again, I think also just much more consistent with a free society if from at a younger age people acquire financial independence, right? In a society where you have the idea of you need your parents and government to support you until you're 25 or 30, right? That does not seem very psychologically supportive of the ideals of free society. It's a lot better if when you're a teenager, the norm is, well, this is time for you to start figuring out how to become an adult. And what adults do is they get jobs and they take care of themselves. And of course, like you start off as a child, we're going to ease you into this transition. Yeah, totally reasonable to think that when you're 20 years old, you'll be able to take care of yourself, just like just like your parents do right now, right? So yeah.
Yeah, if I can sort of go back to one of my earlier questions to you, because I'm thinking that it's not only, let's suppose if some of the viewers who are watching this are libertarians and generally agree with getting the government out of things, but I would like to think that our conservative friends would want to take these arguments seriously as well. And in that context, again, let me sort of make what I think would be part of their case, having many conservative friends who are not quite as anti-government as you or I, perhaps. They would make an argument like the following: well, did not the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson believe that there was this certain need for a literacy to be an informed citizen of a free society and a shared common understanding of things? Even more recently, you may recall that Vincent Ostrom wrote a book on de Tocqueville's challenge. And he talked about that for a culture or society to exist, there needs to be a certain shared common set of values and understandings, cultural foundations, if you will. And conservatives would say, yeah, I agree, school should be locally controlled. The federal government shouldn't be involved in this. And obviously there's a lot of waste and stupid teacher union rules at the local level. But don't we need to at least have a certain amount of a common core, in the sense that many of them believe the founding fathers were referring to, or even someone more recently such as Vincent Ostrom, about the need of a cultural commonality for a society and a country to have some cohesion or glue holding it together?
Right. So three things. So one, of course, I don't want to just talk to our libertarian friends or our conservative friends. I want to talk to our liberal friends. I want to talk to everyone.
I understand.
So I do. I always try to write my books to appeal to people that don't actually agree with me on very much. So there's that. In terms of like what I would say to conservatives, I think I would just tone it down and say, well, how about we just go and cut spending 10%, cut spending by 20%. In terms of the substantive argument, this is where what I have to say is a bitter pill, but it's true, so I have to say it. Namely, if you look at any data that has ever existed, it shows that adult Americans' knowledge of civics, the kind of stuff you're talking about, is near zero. Right? And it's never been any better. Right? We got data going back to the 1930s. Essentially, if you go and create a list of the very most basic imaginable questions about civics, like name the 3 branches of government, how many years does the president serve, what century was the American Revolution in, just go and ask Americans questions like this. Average American adult can get about half right. And that's the reality, right? I'm only a messenger. I don't actually cause this. Now you can look at this either optimistically or pessimistically. You can look at it as an optimist and say, hey, I guess we don't really need to have much knowledge in order to sustain an okay society. Or you can be a pessimist and say, oh my God, this is terrible, doom, right? Again, I tend to think the first thing. But in any case, so what can be done about this? So if we only spend a few weeks on civics, then the natural response, I think for anyone, at least everyone but a libertarian, is to say, well, let's put more time into it. Like the kids don't know very much because we don't spend enough time on it. But the problem is that people do years and years of this stuff, and yet as adults, they don't know it. Probably a lot of what's going on is that they know it on the day of the final exam, and then they forget it afterwards. But again, this is just the reality of what people are like. If you wanted to say, so is there anything that we could do? So here's something that will not appeal to libertarians, but I'd say it's a way better use of taxpayer money than what we currently do. And it's this, right? So get rid of civics education in school, but every year, 3 weeks before every election, we have a national civics test. And if you do well in that test, you get money. The end. All right, why is this a better system than what we currently do? First of all, it encourages people to learn the material in the test by whatever means is most effective for them personally. And I bet virtually no one will go and listen to a typical high school civics teacher go and blather on because they're so boring and they don't learn very much from them. Instead, people will use effective teaching techniques. All right. Secondly, what's really great about this approach is that it encourages retention. If the main problem is that people forget what they learn, then if you go and give them money every single year, they still know the answers. This is a great incentive to actually learn for life and to refresh constantly. Right, which is, of course, the way that anybody who knows how to do anything retains their knowledge is by doing it. Like if you don't use it, you lose it. Right, so again, this is still taxpayer money. It's not libertarian. I'd say this would cost a fraction of all the money we spend on civics and would lead to a noticeably higher level of civic knowledge of adults, which is the key thing, right? Kids knowing how government works doesn't do our society any good, right? It's got to be voters that know something.
Well, you were saying appealing to all across the political spectrum. I could just hear some liberals and progressives saying, oh, he wants to reduce knowledge and understanding to the crassness of the incentive of $1. But it's good for people. It's good for a society. It's what holds us together.
Yeah. The test holds us together or the classrooms hold us together?
Brian, let me hit you with a leftist attack, and it certainly was mentioned in the Washington Post review of your book. If you take away these government subsidies or reduce them, then the argument is that leaves education in the hands of the rich, that only the rich get to go to college and the poor are relegated to remaining uneducated. How do you respond to that argument?
Yeah, so the key thing to remember is if you're talking about education that actually pours useful skills into people, then there's something to that argument. Right, so insofar as education is about building useful skills, if government goes and subsidizes it less, then this is going to mean that rich people get useful skills and poor people at least get fewer. All right, but if the heart of my story is right, namely that a lot of what's going on, really most of what's going on in education, is just that you're jumping through hoops, it's a completely different story. Because in that case, what this means is that there's going to be not just is not that there's going to be a big change in the skills that rich and poor have, but rather there's going to be a big change in the amount of hoop jumping. And you say, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that it changes the meaning of the degree. Back in the 19th century, when a Harvard degree just means that you're a rich kid, employers don't have any real reason to care about it very much because it doesn't say very much about you as a worker, and they know there's still a giant pool of qualified people who don't have the Harvard degree. right? So, on the other hand, in the modern world where the large majority of good workers would have the degree, this gives employers a strong incentive just to say, well, if you don't have the degree, you're probably no good, and throw out your application, not even give you a chance. So I said, really what's going on, and I do have a section on signaling and social justice in the book, is that in the modern world, we focus so much on the one poor kid who gets to go to college and gets a good job. We totally forget all the poor kids that aren't able to even get interviews because they don't have the fancy degrees. Right? And that, I say, if you are a liberal or progressive, you should be really worried about that. In fact, you should be a lot more worried about all the high school dropouts that can't get interviews than about a very rare, talented kid from a poor family that doesn't get to go to a really good school. Right? So again, think about this. Would you rather be a high school dropout today or in 1940? In 1940, there's so many qualified high school dropouts, employers could not afford to just say, you're worthless and I'm not going to consider interviewing you. Now, on the other hand, that is the attitude. Right? And where's the social justice in that? So, basically what I say is that the idea that giving lots of money to education, that it creates equality of opportunity, is deeply misguided, because it's doing the thought experiment of, if we give one kid a little money, does that give him opportunity? And sure. But if you give everybody lots of money, does it give everyone opportunity? And I say no. Really, the main thing that it does is it raises the bar of how much education you need to be considered worthy of employment. And in the book, sort of the main area that I talk about, the main area of social science that's relevant here, is there have been researchers, especially sociologists, who have looked at what's called credential inflation. Namely, they say, so over time, as workers get more and more education, what has happened? Does this mean there's just been a shift into cognitively demanding occupations? Or have we actually raised the bar for how much education you need to get a lower skill job? Like a waiter, a bartender, a cashier, or a concierge at a hotel. And the punchline is, the main thing that has occurred over time is not that we've switched to a very cognitively demanding economy, right? There's been a modest change in that direction. The main thing that's changed is you just now need a lot more education to get one and the same job that your dad or your grandfather would have had, right? And again, if I were a liberal or progressive, I would say that's crazy. And this is a big burden on the poor, that they can no longer just get a good paying job out of high school.
Yeah, one of the interesting points you make is that you could have a young person that cannot get into Princeton, for whatever reason, and decides that he's just going to audit the classes, that he has this thirst for knowledge. He sits in and he really absorbs everything he hears in these lectures. He studies independently. He's got a job on the side, but he's not a registered student. But at the end of the 4 years, he knows more than anyone else in the school. But yet the employer goes not for him because he doesn't have the degree, goes for the guy with a degree. Now, who may not know anything. He's just good at taking tests. So would you analyze that?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of my favorite thought experiments, where I say, look, would you rather have a Princeton diploma without the education, or a Princeton education without the diploma? And what I say is, if you have to think about it, you agree with me already. Because if it is not obvious to you, then you have implicitly admitted that you think that signaling is quite important. In the end, you might say, well, it's a close call, right? Even if you think that it's a close call, you still are granting the basic thesis in my book, which is that signaling is a very big deal. And notice, this is exactly the opposite of how you would think if you were, say, on a desert island. You're stuck there, and then the question comes up, well, would you rather have a boat building degree without a knowledge of boat building, or knowledge of boat building without a boat building degree? And on the island, obviously, I don't care about a stupid degree. I just want to be able to build boats so I can get off the island. But education in modern societies is not like that at all. Rather, people are very concerned about the official certification of it. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Well, define that term signaling. I know you use that a lot in the book, and you've used it today. Define exactly what you mean by that.
Oh yeah, let me just back up one other thing on the Princeton point. So here's the key fact, in case viewers are not aware of it. Colleges do not card. If you want to study anything, you just show up and start going to the classes, and it would be extraordinarily unlikely the professor would even ask, who are you, why are you here? And if you want to be really honest about it, you go up to the professor and say, I'm not really officially a student here, do you mind if I attend? Most professors will get a tear in their eyes, like, oh my God, you actually want to learn what I have to teach? This has never happened before, glorious day. So, I mean, it was I'm not being flippant, or this thought experiment is grounded in fact. This is a genuine opportunity that everybody has, and yet almost no one takes advantage of, because I think that on some level people already agree with me. Now, on what is signaling? So signaling is just it's just another term for jumping through hoops in order to convince people that you're worthwhile, right? So anything that you might do to convince people that you are a worthy employee, for example. And there's lots of things. You might signal with the way that you dress at the interview, or with your hairstyle, or of course you could signal with your lack of tattoos, since tattoos will generally be taken as a bad signal by most employers, especially if it's like the facial spider web tattoo. So many of these are all signals. We signal all the time. But educational signaling, I say, is especially central in the modern economy, because it is really the first thing that employers are likely to consider, especially if you don't have a lot of experience. If you have a lot of experience, then maybe look at your experience first. But if you are trying to go and get your career started, then education is the main thing that we do in our society. So we signal with grades, with diplomas, with your major. Right, all of these things are a package that job seekers acquire in order to convince employers they're worthy. Right, and an analogy that I like is that if you contrast the main story about education that I'm pushing versus the conventional one, right? So, in the same way, so there's two ways you can raise the value of a diamond. One of them is you go and put that monocle on There's two ways to raise the value of a diamond. One is that you get your expert gem cutter to go and cut it perfectly, to go and make the greatest diamond that has ever existed on Earth. The other thing, though, is that you can get a guy to go and get that little eyepiece and look at it and go, yes, this is a perfect diamond. It's wonderful. These are two very different methods of making a diamond more valuable, and they both work, right? And the regular human capital story says that education is like going to a gem cutter who improves the stone. My story, which again I say is most of the story, not all, is that education is a lot more like that. The guy who rates the quality of the diamond. He goes and he looks at it closely, and then he certifies it, and then it does have a higher market value, but not because it has really been improved, but rather because it has been stamped. It has been labeled appropriately, right? And that's really what signaling is all about. It's about, it is about getting your proper stamp, seal of approval. And again, in the book, I talk about all the signs that education has a big signaling element. Like another one is just the way that students are so eager to find easy A's. If you were in school to acquire skills, then you'd be looking around for teachers that teach lots of skills. You wouldn't be going for some easy guy who doesn't really expect anything of you. But on the other hand, if you are looking to get that stamp on your forehead, then it's really great to find the easy professors, because the employers don't know they were easy. So if you find the easiest teacher of astrophysics on Earth, and you get an A+ from him in exchange for saying that that's like Neptune's a planet, the end. Right. Well, employers don't know that you had the easiest teacher in the country or the world on astrophysics, so they say, "Oh, this kid's got an A+ in astrophysics, great." Right. And this is what students are so focused on, is just looking around to figure out a way to get lots of good stamps without having to do very much work, which is exactly the opposite of what they would do if they actually were on school to get skills. To say, well, then where do people acquire skills? They acquire them on the job, generally. That's where most skill formation is happening, and really what your education is mostly about is convincing employers you're worthy of receiving training to be a hotel concierge.
If I can sort of shift to sort of like a next stage of your argument. Let us suppose that someone has, or even a certain group of people have decided that they see the logic of your argument. Mm-hmm. And now it comes as, well, it's not only to know the point on the horizon to which you'd like to move, but how do you get from where you're standing to that point? Mm-hmm. It's sort of like a public choice problem. We have this huge embedded status quo interest group of the teachers associations, the structures of colleges and universities today, the tenured professors themselves and what they expect to learn and absorb, what they expect the students to learn and absorb from them, given what they want to teach and how they've come to believe to teach. How do you break what's your icebreaker to get through this inertia of the existing status quo?
Right. So my view is the main problem by far is the public and none of these interest groups. So, so like if you just go and look at public opinion, overwhelming majorities favor increasing education spending. Almost no one favors reducing it, right? And it's like, so what's going on in the book? I talk about what psychologists call social desirability bias. There's just a whole series of views about the world that sound really good to most people, and so people tend to not only say them but believe them. Just imagine a politician saying we're wasting a lot of money on education, let's cut it. Very hard for anyone to advance saying anything like that, because it just sounds terrible to almost everybody, right? So, and I say even libertarians, I think, get uncomfortable when you talk that way. Even government's putting $1 trillion of taxpayer money on the side of the scales, and yet it's hard for libertarians to say we have too much education. I mean, come on. Of course, if you cut $1 trillion of funding away, the amount of education is going to go down. Like, how else could the world otherwise work? Of course, the government pulls the plug on football stadiums. We're going to have fewer football stadiums. And really, part of being a libertarian is say, okay, I'm going to have to bite the bullet and say something people don't want to hear. Say, yeah, there's going to be less. But that's good because there's too much. I do think that the public is the real problem. So how can you change the public's mind? So that is a really tough question. When I write books, I always try to persuade people who don't agree with me. But still, like in my mind, thinking, well, I'm trying to appeal to the people with common sense and common decency. And, all right, there's some people like that. How do I appeal to all the other people? How do I appeal to the emotional, dogmatic people? I have no skill at that. I just don't know what to do with them. In a way, what I'm kind of hoping is I'll write this book which will persuade a person who has common sense, common decency, and fantastic charisma. And then that person will go and figure out a way of making it palatable to other people. In terms of marginal changes, there's lots of marginal changes that I suggest. Just like, how about cut education spending 1%? Can we do that? Then I talk about just cutting some of the more useless requirements. Like, why do we teach foreign languages in public school? Almost no American needs to know them on the job, and almost no one learns them anyway. Right? For that, there's very clear data. Under 1% of adult Americans even claim to have learned a foreign language very well in school. So what's the point? Right? You just talk about things like, what if we could go and for younger grades just say, look, there's literacy and numeracy that you have to do, and then the rest of the day is recess, or go to the library. Right? You can do it just in terms of bullying kids less anyway. Talk about that. Probably my smallest reform that I advocate in the book is just keeping the school library open. Right? Because just remember, every school I've ever been at, K through 12, there was a great library stocked full of books, and kids are only allowed in there as part of the class. And it's
that's right. The books.
Yeah, the books are there, and so basically there was no time that you could ever even go to the library where taxpayers pay for all this money to have the building and all the books, and then it's like, well, when can I go? Well, you can go as part of the school project, which is a few hours a year, right? To say well, look, if there's a subject where there's where the students are never going to use it again, why can't students just go to the library and read a book instead? I remember when my kids were, when my kids were in, I think, 4th grade, I called up the vice principal and said, look, you have a mandatory dance class. My kids hate this class. Can they just go to the library during that time? And they said, oh, no, there'll be no one to supervise them. And I said, look, how about this? My kids are perfectly behaved, better behaved than most adults will ever be. Tell you what, if there's a single complaint against my kids ever, they're sent back to dance, and you never hear from me again. No, was his answer, of course. Right? But I wanted to try. But anyway, if you just move one, get rid of one teacher that doesn't do it, that teaches some subject hardly anyone likes, replace them with a minimum wage worker to sit in a library and make sure the kids aren't hitting each other. Seems like that would be a big improvement to me. So again, this is very reformist measure. But you have a lot of these things. Ultimately, I am self-aware. I realize that what I'm saying, would bother most people, and that I haven't come up with any way of actually making it appealing to them. Right? And really, a lot, like I say, look, I can try to make this appealing to a reasonable person. I can't make it appealing to a normal person.
All right, guys, we're about out of time. We got to wrap things up. The name of the book, The Case Against Education.
The Case Against Education, and it's only $20 on Amazon. So can you afford not to buy it? Is my question for you.
Do you still have that copy that you can hold up for us, Bryan?
Oh yeah, I sure do. Right here.
Okay,
yes.
The Case Against Education, and
right.
let me emphasize that Bryan teaches economics at George Mason University, which I think everybody would acknowledge is the leading college in the country for people that want to learn free market economics, Austrian economics. And
Mm-hmm.
and Bryan's one of the most popular lecturers there, not surprisingly. And it's fantastic that the book is getting all the notoriety and controversy, including critical commentaries from the
Mm-hmm.
establishment educational.
Yeah.
It's fantastic that you really are causing people to think, which I think is really just
Mm-hmm.
part of the process. It's not
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
necessarily getting them
Yeah.
to agree, it's getting them to start
Mm-hmm.
thinking, because if people start thinking, then we hope that they will reach the right conclusion. On that note, we wrap things up. For
Yeah.
those of you that want to know more about what we do at the Future of Freedom Foundation, come to see us at fff.org. We publish a weekly article by Richard. We publish this, The Libertarian Angle, every week, and I've got my daily blog. And Bryan, it's a real pleasure to have you. Thank you for taking the time to join us. And Richard, as always, has enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, you guys. Thanks so much, you guys, for having me. Always a pleasure. And still, hope I can do it again someday.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you on again.
All right,
Thanks.
yeah. So right now I'm working on a graphic novel on the social science and philosophy of immigration.
Oh,
Yes.
fantastic.
All roads lead to open borders. And I can't actually draw, but I've got one of the world's greatest cartoonists who is collaborating with me.
Yeah, and in fact, on the issue of immigration, I think I mentioned once that you gave the finest exposition in favor of open borders that I've ever heard. I think you did it as part of our lecture series at George Mason.
Yeah, I did. So yeah, I've always remembered that compliment, Jacob. Whenever people have said it's terrible, like, no, it's not terrible. Jacob says it's the best you ever heard.
Yeah,
how could it be terrible?
And I'm an expert. Yeah, in fact, that lecture is online at fff.org, along with a lot of other videos. So, guys, great to see y'all and enjoy the conversation.
All right, thank you. Have a great day.